I agree. New auditorium that seats a couple hundred would be nice. So are there any rebels in the crowd? Any Confederate supporters? None? No one is willing to step forward? Are there any Yankees in the crowd? Wow. Well, I I took on the kind of a crusade in April of 2011 when the sesquicentennial of the Civil War began, and I watched the Missoulian put out one really good story, one story, the Bozeman Chronicle. You know, you go around the state, all the cities ticked off their box. They had a really good article on Montana and the Civil War. And they talked about Thomas Francis Meagher and a few other things. But I waited, you know, don't we play in this national game of the 150th anniversary of the most important war in our history, and something that profoundly changed not only the country but formed and framed first the territory and then the state of Montana? Nothing came. So a couple months into that, I approached the Great Falls Tribune and said, why don't I do a monthly column and take a Civil War person, could be man, woman, or if I could find them, child, and write a story that talked a little bit about where they were from, what they did during the war, why they came to Montana Territory, and what they did after they got here. And they loved the idea, and for 28 months now we've done that. And a month or so after that, I talked to my friends at the Fort Benton River Press, and I spend a lot of time in Fort Benton at the Research Center, and they always love to have historical articles, so they were all for it too. So the only difference was I was word limited with the Tribune, 700 words, and you try to cover all that ground in 700 words, and you really have to craft it. River Press, if I needed it, and in one case I did, for a Confederate who left a diary that has never been published. I think it took about 9,000 words spread through 4 different issues of the newspaper. So in those stories, I could get into great detail, not great detail, but major detail on some of the battles and some of their experiences. I could not have done any of this without the internet. I'd have probably been able to do a couple articles, maybe a quarter or a year, but the speed of being able to gather information on the internet is just stunning. About 7 months ago, the History Press in South Carolina sent me a letter and said, we'd like you to do a book on Montana Territory in the Civil War. And they had seen the articles in the Tribune. Again, the internet made that available across the world, really. And I said, yeah, I would like to, but I want to do it my way. And my way, to me, and something that I don't believe anybody's done before, is overlay the Civil War on the development of events in Montana Territory, what became Montana Territory by 1864, and then what influenced the further development of first the territory and then the state, and then dwell on and weave in stories of a variety of individuals that came here that, you know, we're all more or less descendants of. And they liked that, and so my book, Montana Territory in the Civil War, A Frontier Forged on the Battlefield, took shape. I begin with the upper Missouri and western Montana before the gold strikes, but I don't spend very much time on that. because in 1862, gold was found at Gold Creek, and then all these others fell in rapid succession behind it. That same year, Grasshopper Creek, and next year, Alder Gulch, and so on. Most of you know the gold mining stories and all of the things with it. So I tell them, but I don't dwell on them. And I tell them in a way that some of the participants even in 1862 had been in the war. And so you meet this kind of person. One of the ones I write about, and I just am fascinated by his story because he's absolutely got to be the first Confederate prisoner of war to come to what became Montana Territory, and that's Captain Nicholas Wall. Well, he was Major Nicholas Wall of the Missouri State Guard when they went into camp on the outskirts of St. Louis and were flying secession flags, and their secession governor, Jackson of Missouri, was determined with his state guard to bring Missouri in on the side of the Confederacy. Hugely important events took place in a very short period in May of 1862. Nick Wall was major of commissary. There were 4 other senior officers. And in one night, a young, dashing Union captain took his loyal German immigrant regiments from the arsenal at St. Louis, surrounded Camp Jackson, and had such an overwhelming force facing them in the morning that they surrendered. They didn't have artillery, they weren't equipped, they didn't think that anything like this would happen. And they treated them like prisoners of war. So Nick Wall was a prisoner of war, and he had to sign a parole that called for either him to remain in St. Louis for the duration of the war, or he could come to the Western Territories. And sure enough, the next spring, he was on the Emily, which was the first steamboat that Joe LaVarge brought up the Missouri River that year, loaded with miners headed for the Idaho gold mines. And of course, by the time they got to Fort Benton, the news had spread that there was gold at Gold Creek. And so there's Nick Wall over there. And the rest of Nick Wall's story, which is an amazing story, because here's a guy that without a shot being fired, had been a prisoner, had been paroled, and was now in Montana Territory. And he's the guy that put together with his pork packing friend in St. Louis, John J. Rowe, this integrated operation that within a year and a half had had steamboats, a steamboat line bringing goods cargo to Fort Benton, overland freighting that later became the Diamond R, the R standing for John J. Rowe, his boss, would take it to the gold fields and to Virginia City and so on. And they had their own retail stores. So here was this amazing integrated operation based in St. Louis. Nick Wall never brought his family to Montana, but for the next 8 years, every year he returned to St. Louis and then came back in the spring to run that operation. But I think I'd emphasize also that it isn't all what was going on in Montana Territory or pre-Montana Territory. It was also what was going on in the East, going on in the battlefields in the Western Theater and in the Eastern Theater and in the halls of Congress. Because in the spring, just a magical 3-month period in the spring of 1862, without the obstruction of Southern senators and representatives, they of course had withdrawn, Congress passed an amazing series of 4 pieces of legislation that, in my mind, framed the territory and the state in the future. They passed the Homestead Act. Each of these 4 that I'm going to mention had been blocked for several years by Southern votes in Congress. They passed the Pacific Railway Act. Now, transcontinental railroads were stalled for a few years by the Civil War, but that legislation opened the future of the transcontinental railroads. They passed the Morrill Land Grant College Act, and this weekend, 2 of those land grant colleges are going to duke it out. Go Grizz. And they passed the abolition of slavery in the Western Territories. And that was the first true abolition. It took another year, roughly, for the Emancipation Proclamation to come out, and that only freed slaves in the South that were in conquered territory, parts of Mississippi and so on. And of course, it took until 1865 for the 14th Amendment to do away with that terrible institution and complete the freedom of slavery. I structured the book to weave stories of, in the case of the Profiles of Courage, it's a series of stories of Yankees and rebels in the Eastern and the Western theaters. And you have to understand the Western theater in those days were the total warfare battlefields of Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas, Kansas. Those were battlegrounds, and actually the war had started there a couple of years before the Civil War with raids from abolitionists known as Jayhawkers from the Kansas side going across into Missouri, and vice versa with slave owners and bushwhackers, they called them, going back the other way. And the battle was fought across the border. But once the war started, it was total war, and it affected families in so many cases that I've found. Here's the latest situation, and this is too new for the book because I just did the research for the recent articles, and that is the Moore brothers, Perry and John Moore, both in Missouri, fought for the Confederacy. By the time their war was over, and actually it wasn't over until very late because they were part of a Kentucky cavalry unit that escorted President Jefferson Davis as he fled south, first from Richmond to Danville, and then from Danville down into the Carolinas. And that last leg, the Kentucky 9th Kentucky Cavalry, was part of their military escort. So here were the 2 Moore brothers with that last unit until Davis finally gave up and decided that there was no hope of holding out any further and ordered the rest of the troops to surrender. Lee had already surrendered a month or so before. So Perry and John Moore got back to their homes in Missouri and found their father died before the war, but they found their mother had, with at least two other siblings, had moved west and had gone to Montana Territory. This was 1865. So the Moore brothers did some freighting to make enough money to get themselves to Montana Territory. They're so typical of so many, in this case, of the Southern Confederate troops that had no homes to go back to, or their families had moved during the war to escape the violence going on. I have a section on, I call it from the emancipation to the firing line. It really begins with the story of Robert Gould Shaw, and many of you, I'm sure, have seen the movie Glory. We don't need to talk a lot about Colonel Robert Shaw. Fort Shaw is named after him, the military fort that opened in 1867, right after the war, and today's little town of Fort Shaw. But the thing that I discovered, and I thought was absolutely fascinating, was here's Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, killed in 1863. I'm probably way behind. Oh, I don't want that. Anyway, killed at Camp Wagner when the movie Glory centered on that assault where about half of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first black regiment raised in the North, were casualties in that assault, and Colonel Shaw was killed. But the thing that amazed me was I found two of his men that weren't killed that came to Montana Territory after the war. One of them settled up in the Barker area, gold mining near today's Nyhart. Fairly successful, not gold miner, silver miner. Fairly successful at mining silver. Had enough money after some years of that. He kind of retired to White Sulphur Springs, and I was sorry Lee and her husband couldn't Lee Rustad and her husband couldn't stay because they couldn't have room. But this Joseph Meek, is buried today in Maine, M-A-Y-N, cemetery in White Sulphur Springs. The other 54th Massachusetts soldier came to Lewistown and ran repair shops and various things. He was very well received within the Grand Army of the Republic ranks. He held office with the GAR. He was very popular in the community, and he lived and within a year or so his health gave out, and he went back to the only relative he had, which was a niece, and died in Philadelphia. So he didn't actually die in Montana, but he lived for something like 40 years or so here. And the story of, and I was hoping that Charlene Nava would be able to be here this evening. She got hold of me a couple of years ago and told me the story of James Wesley Crump of Helena and his wife. And his wife had been a slave. Crump had been a free black, had served in the war, had actually made sergeant and came west after the war. His wife was brought by her, technically, I think in 1865, at the point they hopped on a steamboat at St. Louis, I think she was free, but she came with the Evans family to Fort Benton and then Helena, and then she stayed in Helena. They educated her, and of course she was free at this point. And they went on to, I think it was Deer Lodge, the Deer Lodge Valley area, and one of their son actually served in the U.S. Congress. So here's a former Confederate family, slave-owning family, and their son was a U.S. representative, John Morgan Evans. So I do go through the experience of a number of the African Americans. Let me come back to, since I'm jumping around. This very handsome young lady is Varina Davis, President Jefferson Davis's wife. And a number of you, I'm sure, have heard the story of how Virginia City, Montana, got its name. Well, it got its name because in the thousands of miners that flooded in 1863 and more in 1864 into Alder Gulch, and there were perhaps 9 camps formed, the largest of which had to have a name. And the miners wanted Varina as the name for this mining camp in Montana. This is before the territory. This is a year before it became a territory. And a Union-leaning mining court judge, there were no civil authorities here, but mining court judges were somewhat recognized, and he had to sign off on the paper to make official the name. And he crossed out Varina and wrote in Virginia City. That's how Virginia City got its name. And they thought, or he thought, well, that's still close enough for these Southern sympathizers. The great shame in 1863 and 64 is that while there was a census hurriedly done in the fall of 1864, because the territory had to have elections, they had to have a quick census, they didn't record where you were born or where you came from, so there's no measure in that census except these were white adult males. I mean, that's all we have from that census. But I think if you did have a true survey, a good survey, a good census, in that period when they claim there was something like 10,000 miners in the length of the Alder Gulch area, that the majority were either from the border states or from the South. And that leads to the myth or the claim that the left wing of Price's army came to Montana. Well, Price was General Sterling, Pap was his nickname, Price. Pap Price commanded Southern military forces not only in Missouri but often they were kicked out of Missouri, and so he roamed, and he had both conventional forces and unconventional ones like Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, and if you can imagine how difficult it is to do research on those Confederate units, even the best of the Confederate units had pretty shaky and incomplete records, and the unconventional ones are pretty non-existent. But here's the large number coming out during the war, and by 1870, when the first U.S. official census, well, it showed, it was a pretty good mix between northern, southern, and border. I mean, it was almost a third, a third, a third. That's 3/3. So, the argument that they say is, well, there wasn't that great a Confederate leaning or Southern sympathizing influence in Montana Territory, at least in 1870. And they're absolutely right. But it had been a lot greater earlier, and it led to some pretty. While we didn't have battles in Montana, and yet we did in a lot of ways, they were fueled by hard feelings and strong feelings on both sides, including the ones that came. I wanted to read just a little bit. One of the, I think, great men that came to Montana Territory was Martin McGinnis. He was an officer at the point of Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg. He was a lieutenant, and he was with the 1st Minnesota Infantry at Gettysburg. And on the second day, Sickles had a Union corps that was supposed to be holding Cemetery Hill. And through inexplicable idiocy, he moved his forces off the hill down toward Confederate forces. and they got royally beat up and overrun. And here's high ground that the Union, thanks to Howard and a few other smart leaders the first day of the battle, had been able to occupy. And as you probably all know, on the third day was critical in defeating things like Pickett's Charge and so on, because the Union had the high ground. Well, Sickles goofily moved his forces forward. So General Winfield Scott Hancock came riding up to Cemetery Hill, and all that was there was 252 men from the 1st Minnesota Regiment. And he had other reinforcements coming, but they were 10 minutes or so away, which was not enough time to get there to stop the Confederates from overrunning the hill. So that's the situation, and Martin McGinnis often spoke and sometimes gave orations on this famous 1st Minnesota charge at Gettysburg. And I'll just read a little bit. The rebel batteries poured grape and canister into the retreating groups being Sickles' Union forces, and their infantry advancing with triumphant yells, the Confederates advancing, showering rapid volleys of leaden hail into the broken ranks, which were reeling and staggering back, but still turned to make fight like some feeble but spirited man beneath the blows of a young and vigorous giant. And he goes on, Hancock rode up and, unable to conceal his agitation, asked in almost anguished terms, "Great God, is this all the men you have here?" And turned to the right, from which was hastening the reinforcements, and they were still 10 minutes or so away. If Hancock could only stop, and this is McGinnis again, if Hancock could only stop that charging mass for 5 minutes, a hope lit up on his face, and pointing to the smoke-concealed masses of the advancing foe, he cried, "Colonel Colville, commander of the 1st Minnesota, advance and take those colors." And of course, the Confederates had 2 divisions, which was 10 times the force that the 1st Minnesota had. It's an easy thing to charge, McGinnis says, when the enemy is retreating and the battle is going well, but it requires steady troops to even hold a position when the line is breaking away on every side. And it was a strange order to give a handful to charge that advancing mass that had just carried 2 of our best divisions off their feet. "Forward," shouted our gallant colonel. And so the 1st Minnesota charged. And they fired a volley, they had their bayonets fixed, and they rammed headlong into this overwhelming force. And they stunned the Confederate forces so much that they stalled them, and the reinforcements came up, and 47 men from the 1st Minnesota were still standing on their feet, including Martin McGinnis. He was one of 5 officers still on their feet. And they had turned the tide and held Cemetery Hill, and that played an important part in the next day's victory for the Union at Gettysburg. The other brief thing I wanted to read is, to me, a really fascinating. I've looked in all my research for women that played roles that I could, there's no question, because they kept the home and in a lot of cases the farms going, their men were gone fighting, there's no question the women had a huge part in the war. But I wanted to identify specific women that were either nurses or spies or teachers for the Freedmen's Bureau or whatever. And that's really hard to do because women, even the nurses, didn't enlist. and they didn't get pensions after the war, and they aren't in the official records. But I did find a number of them, and I've got a number in the book. One of them is Miss Harriet A. Lewis, who happened to have a pretty fascinating couple years that I'll very briefly mention to you. I begin this by saying on Memorial Day 1897 at the Opera House in Great Falls, attorney William H. Smith paid moving tribute to the women of the Civil War. Let us not forget the noble women of the war, or their deeds of mercy and of heroism. We seldom hear a word, and yet the preservation of this nation is largely due to their great patriotism and devotion. For 4 long years, mothers, wives, sisters, daughters worked and wept in that awful night of grief. They nursed the sick, dressed the painful wounds, and lulled the parting souls to eternal peace. Well, Harriet was a young teacher. She was about age 22 when this happened. She was recruited. She lived in Illinois. She was recruited by the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, that organization was formed during the war to go into occupied Southern territory and do critical things to help the newly freed slaves. Part of it was feeding, part of it was trying to begin education and schools, and so on. So the Freedmen's Bureau played a hugely important role even before the war ended. And young Harriet Lewis was sent to Mississippi, occupied Mississippi. The Union forces had control, but they didn't necessarily have the hearts and minds of the Mississippians. So from 1865 to 67, Harriet Lewis taught schools for freed slaves in the South. A glimpse into her experience and challenges is found in 2 letters she wrote in 1866 while serving in Mississippi. Those letters, by the way, are in Bozeman in the special collections at Montana State University. Teaching in Aberdeen, Mississippi, Harriet noted that she was greeted locally as, quote, nigger teacher Yank, unquote, though less often than she had been previously. She observed, I find the freedmen here much oppressed and very destitute. I have visited among them all I could out of school hours, and in enough wretchedness and suffering to make the stoutest heart ache. I almost feel sometimes as though it was wrong for us to be so very comfortable while there are so many poor, half-clad, half-starved creatures in the world, and I am thankful I can do even a little to help them. Well, she was moved to another school, and she and another teacher were renting a house from, she calls it a Dutchman, very likely a German immigrant. And then they were threatened with being turned out of the house because the Dutchman was receiving threats that the house would be burned down unless he turned the freedmen teachers out. And that's the kind of environment she was operating in, and she stuck with it. She married a Civil War soldier. They came to Bozeman because he was a civil engineer and worked on irrigation projects around Bozeman not after the war, but about 2 decades after the war, and they spent the rest of their life in Montana. What do I have? Oh, there's not Harriet, but the type of schools the freedmen were trying to set up. And then there's the rebels. Here's old Robert Chesnut. And if you know Montana, you know there's a Chesnut Valley. Well, the Chesnut Valley has a T in it, Chestnut. Well, it's named after Robert, who didn't have a T in his name. And when the post office, the postal department named that post office Chustnut, he had a fit. And of course, he had no influence, but he said, I'm no damn nut. so they shouldn't have a T in there. Chesnut was such a character. He had been raised in a Union-leaning part of Kentucky, but his family were pro-Southern. And before the war, Robert had moved west to Texas and joined the 6th Texas Cavalry. They were one of those units that, although it sounds like a good formal military unit, they broke into small groups and fought a lot of unconventional warfare type operations, sometimes attached and working with Quantrill and sometimes with others. I wouldn't know a whole lot about Robert Chesnut if it weren't for a friend of mine who lives in Fort Shaw, Dick Thurman. The Thurman family came to Montana Territory after the war. One of them, Thomas Thurman, had been an officer in the Confederate Army. Dick's direct ancestor had not, but the family was certainly Confederate leaning. And they were about the only ones in the territory around today's Cascade and that general area that could get along with Bob Chesnut. And of course, they both were unreconstructed Southerners, so they got along famously. Here's old Chesnut by his cabin with his rifle. His rifle today is in the Charlie Russell Museum because of the Thurmans. His powder flask from an earlier day was also in the CMR Museum. And some absolute gems like this writing in an autograph book that a young Thurman received in 1882 as a Christmas gift. On the first page, Captain Robert Chesnut, Company A, 6th Texas Cavalry Sharpshooters, Confederate States of America, proudly written in there by Bob Chesnut. And there are also letters that Dick has that Chesnut wrote back and forth. One of them is just too classic to not share with you, although if you buy the book, you'll see it. In 1888, he'd sent a letter to his Kentucky family, postmarked Sun River, and it read, "If there is any good-looking old maids or rich widows without children, please recommend me to them. Tell them I am a rebel and a drinking sort of a connection and a good fiddler and a hell of a fellow generally. And if any of them likes the recommend, tell them to write me a long letter, giving her name, pedigree, etc." There's no evidence he ever got any letters back. There's, I mentioned briefly James Wesley Crump. I think many of you probably have some understanding of what the black community in Helena was like in the late 19th century and beyond. But this is at the dedication of the new Montana State Capitol. The Grand Army of the Republic are together here, and they're chosen to hold the U.S. flag was Corporal James Wesley Crump. And there's Clarissa Jane Powell, the slave I mentioned earlier that had come up, and after arriving here a couple of years later, she met Crump and she became Clarissa Jane Crump. And they are maybe the only black family I know that had Civil War veterans that still live in Montana. There may be others, but I don't know of them. And the wonderful thing was when Charlene Neva got hold of me, her husband is the direct descendant. But the family, starting with James Wesley Crump, had very carefully kept things like his discharge from the Union Army and photos, and I mean, wonderful memorabilia. Hopefully someday it may come to the Montana Historical Society, but in the meantime, these photos, among other things, we can share with you because they kept them. Any of you know who this is? You all know who Thomas Francis Meagher is. Meagher was too good to not play up in my book. I actually selected this to be I proposed to the publishers, this is the cover. There's our beloved acting one at the rededication, I think it was 2011, right? I'd come over and the Hibernians were going strong and they had the bunting out. It really fine photo. They said, it's got to be a battle scene. And I said, but there were no battles in Montana. And they said, well, here's Thomas Francis Meagher in battle, in the Civil War. That's good enough. So they opted for that. I've got quite a bit about Meagher in here, including some that's my own analysis. And I mean, Paul Wiley did a wonderful job in his book, the best book on Thomas Francis Meagher. But there's some fresh material in here, and his story's just too good to pass up. And he's a bit of I'd say, I'd just spend a couple of minutes saying that I've got some profiles and short stories of each of the early territorial governors, in a couple of cases acting governors. Excuse me. And I did that because, again, it shows the influence of the Civil War on Montana Territory. It's something like the first 8 territorial governors or acting governors were all veterans of the Civil War. They were all Unions, of course. One of them had actually not fought in the Civil War, but he'd been an official in the Dakota Territory through the war. Another one, James Ashley, great story. You've got to read about James Ashley. Ashley was appointed, Ashley was the chair in Congress during the war, so again, I give him a pass on not being in combat. He was the chairman of the Territories Committee in the House of Representatives. He's the one that selected the name Montana. He's the one that got the legislation through for Lincoln to sign on the 26th of May, 1864, the creation of Montana Territory. But that's the good news. The bad news is that James Ashley had also led the charge to impeach President Johnson. And that forever made him a deadly enemy of the Democrats. And of course, by the end of the war, the Democrats were back in Congress. One by one, the southern states came back in and so on. So when Ashley was appointed by Grant to come be governor of Montana Territory, and Montana Territory at the time was pretty strongly pro-Democrat, and I've got to talk a little about war versus peace Democrats after this, but by the end of the war, there was only basically one Democrat party. The Southerners, the Northerners that were Democrats were all part of the Democrat Party. Ashley came to Montana Territory and said, I'm going to go around the state and make so many friends, I'm going to convert everybody to a Republican. So here he came. Within a year, it was just bell clear that he had totally failed for never explained reasons. Grant removed him after about a year. It took another 6 months or so to get his successor here, but I do want to just mention how important it is to understand politics during the Civil War. The Republicans were not totally united themselves. They were basically all Lincoln Republicans, but there were Republicans who were abolitionists, and there were Republicans who were really soft on abolition. They supported it, but anyway. But the Democrats were just absolutely split in two by the war. And I'm not talking about the Southern Democrats, I'm talking about the Northern Democrats. There were the War Democrats and the Peace Democrats. And the War Democrats were Thomas Francis Meagher, a lot of the immigrant Irish, a lot of the others in the North, including a lot that came to Montana Territory. And they were willing to fight for the Union. They did not want the country split, but they wouldn't vote for Lincoln or, well, I shouldn't say they wouldn't vote for Lincoln. They were not Republican, and they would not support Republicans in Congress, for instance. The Peace Democrats were split a bit among themselves. Some of them wanted outright to sell out whatever the South wanted, we'll agree to, just end the war. It sounds a little bit like Vietnam to me, but anyway. So the War Democrats and the Peace Democrats battled. In 1864, when it became time for Lincoln's renomination, his convention was going to be held in Baltimore about 2 weeks after Montana became a territory. And Montana was invited to send a delegate. But how would you get a delegate? How would you even get news to Montana to get a delegate there? Well, you got that by forming a caucus of 3 Montanans, new Montanans, because the legislation had just been signed, to meet together. And it was, the convention was not a Republican Party convention, it was the National Union Convention. The Republicans had changed the name so that they could attract and not alienate the War Democrats. They were critical to the war, and they were also important for Lincoln's reelection. So 3 guys met in Washington, D.C. and selected the delegate for Montana. It was Republican newly governor Sidney Edgerton, Democrat Sam Hauser. You've got all kinds of evidence of him around here, the dam and so on. He was a War Democrat. And Nathaniel Langford, and he was a War Democrat. So the 3 of them selected Langford, sent him off to the convention, so Montana was represented at the first convention after the territory was created. So there are stories like that involving the politics. I'd like to end with well, I'll mention this. Unity, the last chapter I call the what do I call it? It's pretty clever. The legend of victory and the lost cause live on. Well, the legend of victory is the thousands, in fact, the hundreds of thousands of Union Civil War veterans that joined the Grand Army of the Republic, and for the next roughly 40, 50 years after the war, had huge influence in nationally as well as in Montana Territory. And I go into quite a bit about this in that last chapter, because counterbalancing that is the legend of the lost cause. And even before the war ended, Southerners, especially Southern women, were forming the myth that the lost cause myth. And the first book published by the South after the war was called The Lost Cause, came out in 1866. And it's the myth that led to minstrel shows and the plantation, beautiful plantation life with those darkies and those peaceful slaves, and the fact that the South hadn't really lost the war. And it went into Birth of a Nation, and it went into earlier the KKK and so on. So I go into, I do balance the book better than it sounds, because I feel that whether you're a Montanan with southern roots or northern roots, your story should be in here. And I'm sounding pretty abolitionist, I suppose, but it's fairly balanced. I may have to do another book on the Confederates that came to Montana Territory, but Soldiers Monument, I'll just mention very briefly. This, in Great Falls, in an area called Soldiers Plot, is the first monument in the country that had recognition of both Union and Confederates in the same monument. And there's a panel on this south side that says, "To the boys in gray," and on the north side, "To the boys in blue." And then on the west side, to the boys from the Indian Wars, and so on. I did want to take just a couple minutes and then open up for questions. The Civil War sesquicentennial is not over, and I'm determined to keep working. The articles are continuing, but very importantly, I joined with the Great Falls Public Library to apply for the Gilder Learman Civil War 150 traveling Civil War traveling exhibition. And we were one of 50 venues in the country selected for that. We'll have the exhibit opening in Great Falls the 26th of May next year. We'll have it for 3 weeks. How perfect is it that the 26th of May happens to be the exact 150th anniversary of Montana Territory? And as part of that, we'll have reenactors, we'll have Civil War displays in a series of 10 public events. And I just wanted to throw this up here. The kinds of events we're going to have will be music, the 3rd U.S. Volunteers encampment. The 3rd U.S. Volunteers would be a whole story in itself, because they're galvanized Yankees. And if you don't know what a galvanized Yankee is, read the book. But actually, they're Confederates that were captured and in Union prison camps in Virginia, I think all of them were. And they were given the option of joining the Union Army as long as they were signed to the Western Territories and not to have to fight their Southern brothers. So 3 regiments of volunteers were formed, former Confederates with Union officers, and they came to the Dakota Territories. And this, one of the reenactment groups, the last I heard, they're 6 men strong now, are the 3rd U.S. Volunteers. There's also reenactors that have contacted me from Laurel. It's a husband-wife. She plays Clara Barton, and he was playing some nondescript Michigan infantry captain, and I talked him into changing over, so he's going to play Martin McGinnis, which will be fun. Rich Osted from the Historical Society is going to share insight into the Civil War treasures here at the Historical Society with us. And then 2 friends of mine and I are going to be Yankees and Rebels. Dick Thurman has agreed to come in his Confederate uniform and represent the Rebels, and a black friend of mine, Bob Harris, will join me as Union soldiers, and so we'll be talking about that in one of the events. So with that, it's a great Christmas present.